I'm Tom. That over there is Mike. And I feel like it's finally time, as a man on the internet, to give my point of view of women in both sports and athletics. That's why today's video is a brief history of women's wrestling in WCW. For those of you who haven't seen any of the prior videos, these only go back to when Ted Turner bought WCW in late 1988, so I know that Misty Blue Sims took off Jim Cornette's pants in a cage once or something, and Mildred Burke was one of the all-time great draws in wrestling history back in her day, but I'm not the expert to talk about that, so I'm not going to do so. Now you're probably asking, Tom, didn't the women's revolution start like in 2015? And I say to you, no. We're going back to September 1990. Jim Herd's running the show, and he needs something to spice up some cards coming up that fall. So Jim Herd hits up the LPWA, which was one of many attempts to be like wrestling, but women. And since she was local to a lot of the tapings, they started using Bambi, this southern indie wrestler with the dope-ass mullet. She does about a month worth of shows for them that September. In fact, she even shows up on the Clash of the Champions, losing to LPWA champion Susan Sexton, even though Sexton bailed and Bambi stayed around. She also wrestles a mixed tag match on Worldwide, where they pair a woman with an enhancement wrestler, because that's about how they were seen level-wise. Bambi and old Reno Riggins defeated Scrap Iron Bill Ford and Peggy Lee Leather, who was another star of the Southern Indies from that fabulous Moolah camp in South Carolina, but most notably she's known for wrestling Bambi approximately 8,000 times in front of people, and who knows how many more times in the hotel room. I really think there's a great opportunity for some scriptwriter out there in Hollywood to create his own heated rivalry, but it's wrestling and it's about Peggy Lee Leather and Bambi. You know, they're rivals who grapple in the ring, and then they go to the Holiday Inn and they tangle up their mullets with passion. Anyway, after that month, women just completely disappear from the wrestling rings of WCW. Because you see, back then, women were kind of like short folks or tag teams. They were a genre, not a gender. Fast forward to October of 91, where Madusa debuts. She had, gained her fame in the AWA in Japan, but now it's time for them to give women's wrestling a real shot. She ends up defeating both of the Glamour Girls, Judy Martin and Leilani Kai, in consecutive matches on WCW TV. She also beats up Bambi, because why not? But after a month, they're all like, why are these women wrestling? That's crazy. And Madusa gets moved over into being the second manager in the Dangerous Alliance, the Director of Covert Operations, which is a completely different position from the Director of Covert Operation, which was Larry Zbyszko. He had a real steady hand, could move those tweezers without going bzzz. I'm horrible at it. Madusa mostly just like climbs cages and beats up dudes wearing evening gowns and stuff. Doesn't actually get much ring time. When the Dangerous Alliance breaks up that fall, she goes around the horn with Paulie Dangerously doing like these 5-minute gimmick matches. Beginning in 93, Madusa gets sick of not being able to wrestle like a serious wrestler. She leaves WCW to go to where all the serious wrestlers wrestle, the WWF. Late 1995, there's the weird story. Madusa, aka Alundra Blaze, gets fired from the WWF, even though she's holding the women's title at the time, and they just scrap the division altogether, whether it be budget cuts or extracurricular matters with a member of the clique who may or may not be like 6'10", but says he's 7 feet tall. She shows up on Nitro, does a bad job of recycling. She's like, this is where the big girls play. I'm here to wrestle women, seriously. And other than one 2-minute match with Sherry Martel for the love of Colonel Rob Parker, she doesn't have a wrestling match against another woman until August. If she's in the ring, she's mostly throwing around Robert Fuller. August 96, they finally bring in a woman to wrestle Madusa. Sonny Ono presents Bull Nakano. I know Americans normally pronounce it Nakano, but I believe that's the actual pronunciation. Trying to be respectful here. The whole feud starts because Madusa's a motorcycle person, a bike lady. She's gonna ride her bike to hog wild in Sturgis, and Sonny Ono doesn't like that, because the Japanese, they make the best vehicles, and we're scared of them, because they're gonna take our jobs, darn it. We were so much meaner to the Japanese back then than we are to AI today, and It's like a million times worse now. I don't get it. Anyway, Bull Nakano comes in because she also believes that American motorcycles suck, and they have a feud over whose motorcycle's gonna get smashed in Sturgis. Madusa wins one for the old US of A, Hog Wild. She smashes that Kawasaki bike in the name of America, and then nothing bad ever happened here again. That November, a women's title tournament actually does begin. WCW forms a partnership with the Gaia promotion in Japan. A couple of Japanese wrestlers that come over, like for instance Zero, aka Chigusa Nagayo, the subject of that really cool Netflix show last year. But she's like wearing face paint and dyed her hair black and wears leather. Not at all like anybody else on the show at that time. Also Akira Hokuto, who becomes Madusa's rival for most of the next year. As well as Reina Jabuki, a masked wrestler who looks just like Akira Hokuto, but in a mask. Hokuto wins the women's title tournament, defeating Madusa in the finals at Starrcade, and beginning a whole rivalry because Madusa again wants to bring that title belt back to the good old US of A. Why is Madusa so wrapped up in nationalistic pride? Like she's like the ovarian patriot. But then after Starrcade, Madusa and Akira Hokuto both disappear from television. But now, since we don't have time on the shows for the regular women's title, we definitely need to add a second one. So that March, WCW brings out the women's Cruiserweight title. That's right, for the itty bitty women. I think the point of this was that they realized that a lot of the younger Japanese women coming in from Gaia were really tiny compared to like the Bull Nakanos and the Madusas of the world. And they wanted to replicate the success of the Cruiserweight division with the men. It didn't quite go that way. The entire Cruiserweight women's title tournament was contested in pre-show matches before Monday Nitro tapings, when the buildings were like not even halfway full. The matches would air like a week later on WCW Main Event, which was on Saturday mornings at like 9 a.m. Matches were like never acknowledged on Nitro or I think even Saturday night. They just kind of rushed through the thing, and before the April 7th Monday Nitro, Toshi Uematsu defeated Malaya Hosaka to win the WCW Women's Cruiserweight title, the first champion, and then the title was never defended in WCW again. They just sent it over to Gaia and they were like, that's your problem now. A couple weeks before that end of March, Luna Vachon debuts, because if Medusa's around somewhere, Luna has to follow. Most of the run, it seems like she thinks that Medusa's the women's champion for some reason. Like nobody told her about Akira Hokuto at all. Madusa beats Luna at Spring Stampede and seems to be on her way back to the women's title. Then there's a really weird situation. The weekend of May the 1st on the WCW B and C shows, the Saturday nights, the pros, the worldwides, the commentators are instructed to start saying that Madusa defeated Akira Hokuto for the women's title in Japan. Problem is, she didn't. They didn't even wrestle. No such match existed. Not only that, neither Madusa or Akira Hokuto were even told that there was going to be this imaginary title switch happening. So they're doing press in Japan, and like the magazine writers are like, hey, what's going on here? Like Akira Hokuto literally found out she lost the belt from a magazine writer at a press conference. But a week later, in order to appease the Japanese media, they start saying that it was a thing that Sonny Ono made up. And then by Slamboree in May, they're saying that it was a real match, but now Sonny Ono, instead of making up that it existed, he's now got a court injunction saying that it didn't happen, and he kept the belt on Akira Hokuto through the judges. Madusa does get her title shot at that Slamboree pay-per-view, and loses again. Second straight time she loses to Akira Hokuto, clean in the middle of the ring. She's just not as good as Akira Hokuto in canon. And then she comes out on Nitro a week or two later. She's like, I'm desperate. I need this title. I am like the only woman making a full-time paycheck in this company for wrestling. So here's what I'm going to do. If I lose this match at the Great American Bash that I want from you and don't get the title, I'm going to retire and go home and hang out with my husband at the time, who played for the Cincinnati Bengals, and whose name I forget, but I really don't want to Google it because I'm already running late recording this as is. Great American Bash comes around, again, the ovarian patriot that she is, wearing the red, white, and blue gear. USA, USA, going up against the evil Japanese villain, career versus title, and she loses again. And she retires, and it gets real weird when she's crying in the ring, and everyone's just sad, and then they move on because we got to get to the NWO. And then Akira Hokuto is just never brought back into WCW. And the women's title goes bye-bye. Women's wrestling was kind of sparse for a couple years in WCW from that point. Jacqueline becomes a thing. Kevin Sullivan does this really smart thing where he's basing his squash matches around her beating up dudes because it gets by far the biggest reaction he's going to get at that point. It's kind of weird because he's a heel, but the place is going crazy when she does it. Reactions are scarce, take them when you can get them. And that leads to the whole Jacqueline Disco Inferno brouhaha where they want her to wrestle him. I think it was at Censored that year, and Disco's like, no, I can't lose to her. She has breasts and a vagina. I can't do that. So he gets fired from WCW. But since this is WCW, he comes back a few months later, not only unpunished, but they put the TV title on him. But he still has to do that job to Jacqueline, which he does at Halloween Havoc. But they do a lot of like, oh, he can't touch her and he's running from her. And like there's a weird state athletic commission storyline where they explain that's why she doesn't win the TV title when she beats him, whatever. And then because this is the world in 1997, Jacqueline, the winner of the match and the more over of the two, is slowly written off the show. And we get way more Disco Glenn. In 1998, pretty much the only women's wrestling that happens in WCW is this series of pre-show and tryout matches that happen at various WCW shows in Florida throughout the year. The aforementioned Malaya Hosaka, who is not Japanese, despite what WCW wanted you to believe. They would say that she was from Gaia when they didn't have any actual Gaia Joshi wrestlers to bring in. She wrestles a young Spitfire named Starla Saxton, not Susan Sexton, like many people in the early internet believed, but Starla Saxton. We didn't have that many names for women back then. Matches were good enough that one of them did make it to TV from Universal Studios, September 97, WCW Worldwide, but for now, neither of them get a full-time job. That is until Macho Man Randy Savage gets involved. You know, Randy Savage, that champion of women's sports that he was. You see, Randy got a new girlfriend, and he saw what was happening in the WWF with Sable, and he thought, oh, my girlfriend kind of looks like her. She can be Sable here. And so he essentially personally hires Starla Saxton to train his girlfriend to wrestle. WCW's like, well, we need somebody of like name value that we can say trained her also. So they bring back Madusa, who I guess is just unretired at this point. Starla Saxton becomes Miss Madness, who was like a beauty pageant queen for some reason. And Randy Savage gets himself a posse of ladies. I said posse. Posse. And because Randy puts his stamp of approval on the women, they start getting more TV time. Madusa and Miss Madness do more wrestling. Miss Madness becomes Mona when she splits off from the group because, you know, women be fighting. And then because Mona is under contract, they're like, shit, we have to like book her to wrestle. So they bring in these indie wrestlers like Dee Dee Venturi and Little Jeannie and Brandy Alexander to wrestle her because they needed to fill TV time, and Randy Savage would get mad if they fired the woman that he got hired. October comes, Vince Russo gets hired, and he's like, why can't the women wrestle the men? The women become cruiserweights, and all the men on the internet got really mad at that point because how dare men and women pretend to fight each other on television? Arr. Russo also hires Rhonda Singh, aka Monster Ripper, aka Bertha Faye, mostly to make fat jokes about her and be really mean. She comes back into play after all the fat jokes later on. We'll talk about it in a second. Of course, Madusa wins the Cruiserweight title at Starrcade from Evan Courageous when she like hornies him to death. She was like having sex with him so that he would lose the title to her. What I don't understand is why didn't like Cyclope try that? And then Oklahoma, who qualified as a cruiserweight because he wrote for Weird Science, defeated Madusa at Sold Out for the Cruiserweight Championship. And that weekend, Vince Russo got sent home. And they're like, shit, we don't want Oklahoma to be the Cruiserweight champion. So they stripped him of it. And he stops wrestling. They kind of try to do an actual women's division at this point. They have Madusa there. They have Mona. Bring in some of the indie wrestlers that Mona was wrestling with. Rhonda Singh's involved. They even bring back Sherry for a match or two. Oklahoma was the commissioner of this makeshift women's division because we had to have some sort of heel sexism involved. For the most part, the women's division was trapped to Saturday Night and Worldwide because the men needed their time on Thunder, damn it. And then Russo comes back, and that shit is over with. We can't have women wrestling women. They gotta be wrestling men, and they gotta be doing sexy things. I'm not even doing a Russo impression. I'm just imitating a man. Mona ends up getting fired because why do we need women who can wrestle? It gets mostly written off the show. Daphne, who, wonderful character, one of the sweetest people in the history of the industry, but not at the time, not a trained wrestler, wins the Cruiserweight title. Russo is just obsessed with women holding the Cruiserweight title. And in September, Madusa does get another short television storyline because she agreed to be thrown off of scaffold in order to get TV time. Fall Brawl, they do a mixed tag team Pittsburgh plunge match where they built like a scaffold up by the stage. And then wouldn't you know, that was pretty much the end of women's wrestling in WCW. What a run. It was the 90s. Everyone was shitty to women, but in typical WCW fashion, they were even shittier. So if you liked this video, make sure up here, like, comment, subscribe, click the hype button. It gets me in front of more eyeballs. I love you if you do it, and if you don't do it, then I guess you're going to hell when you die. Sorry, don't make the rules. Check out my live streams every other Sunday here on YouTube and Twitch, and then every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, exclusive to Twitch. Make sure to become a paid member, like all these wonderful, beautiful names you're seeing right now. All great people who push in the shopping carts at the store and help old women across the street. And they get a bonus stream once a month where we watch something that's not wrestling. So again, my name's Tom. That back there's Mike. And we did it, guys. We solved gender inequality.